Hey, it's Amy from Following Hawks, and if you didn't know, I have a podcast called The Earth Keepers, and I'm currently in season 3 where I'm telling the story about what happens when an entire group of people leave the only land they've ever known. And I'm doing that by following my own ancestry back through the pioneer days into Utah and the Mormon Church, and then back to Sweden. So go listen to the podcast. If you haven't heard that, I will include a link below because that is the whole big story that I'm currently telling. However, I am sharing here on YouTube the individual interviews that I have done with some of the experts on the topic. So today's conversation is an interview with researcher Cody Noconi, and he has a podcast himself called Mormons and Drugs podcast. So we're talking today all about the founding of the Mormon Church and asking the question whether or not Joseph Smith was spiking the sacrament in the early days. So here you go. Enjoy my conversation with Cody.
Tell me a little bit about your background with the church and how you got to this point to start looking into all of these topics.
So I grew up Mormon. My family's all Mormon. I went to seminary school, did all of that. I left when I was 18, so I did not go on a mission. But when I went to high school and was like learning how to write, and I kept studying history because I really liked history. I started seeing some weird correlations between magic, historical drug use, and the stuff that Joseph was talking about. I eventually found Robert Beckstead's paper. Dr. Beckstead is a retired emergency room doctor who was working with ketamine as a tranquilizer and started to notice that people were having transcendent experiences while they were on ketamine. And that kind of spiraled his interest. So he eventually wrote a paper that was speculating that perhaps Joseph was using some type of psychedelic to initiate the trance states that he would go into, or the revelatory states he would be in, where he would kind of act as the mouthpiece of God. And then he also had a seemingly uncanny ability to induce visions in others, which is also very suspect. I originally kind of got into this theory because I kind of wanted to disprove a lot of Dr. Beckstead's work. I thought it was a little too speculative, and I was just like, there's maybe a little bit, but this is too much. And then the deeper I dug, the more I realized, no, he was right. He nailed down Datura pretty well. That's probably what they were using, and the ways they were using it. I have I agree with his speculation on mushroom use, but I would say that it's not as amanita heavy as he would suggest. There's plenty of other varieties that do it just as well. But yeah, I got into that. I started to realize that he's right, and it just kept diving down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. I eventually found Bryce Blankenagel of the Naked Mormonism podcast. Very nice guy. I think he does the Glass Box podcast now. I haven't spoken to him in a while, but we wrote a paper for Sunstone in 2017 that kind of expanded on Dr. Beckstead's original paper. And then since then, I've spent a few years kind of condensing it all into one big book that I released last October. Oh my God, it's been a year. And yeah, I've just been kind of slowly pushing it while I am a working stiff.
Yeah, well, and what is, for those who don't know, what is Sunstone?
Sunstone is a sort of annual conference that highlights Mormon everything. So like anybody who writes papers about Mormonism or theories about Mormonism, or kind of want to share their perspective or philosophy on it. It's a kind of a, I think the last one I went to, it was titled Sunstone, More Than One Way to Mormon. And it was just like everybody's kind of take on the thing. It's very pro Mormon, but also kind of tackles some of the tougher issues, which I really admire. They let Bryce and I talk in their symposium, which was, I did not expect, and I was very surprised at how kind of open everybody was to the idea. But yeah, I believe it's still going. It's usually every summer around July.
Well, all right. Well, let's get into, and also for people who don't know, because there's a lot of people, a lot of non-Mormons in my audience. What makes Mormon beliefs different from kind of, general Christianity? There's a lot of similarities, but there's some major differences. What would you say are the main differences?
There's even some infighting about whether or not Mormons are actually Christian, but we won't get into that. I think the biggest things that kind of separate Mormons from a lot of other Christian sects is how they define God, and kind of they have a very specific take on God, and the kind of heavenly plan. There is a sort of tiered system of heaven, which is not entirely unique. There's some other religions that do that, but essentially there's 3 levels of heaven, and then there is no hell, quote unquote, a fiery place. There's just what they call outer darkness, which is what's for everybody else. And was founded by a teenage boy in upstate New York during the burned over district of New York during the early 1820s. Didn't actually become a religion until like the 1830. And I think the thing that makes it most unique is that it was ran and operated by a revelatory seer who was trying to bring back like an apostolic version of Christianity that was more Pentecostal, a lot more what we would recognize today as like evangelical. They've very much toned down a lot of that since then, but it was its own kind of unique occult Christian thing where you could express yourself in more of a Pentecostal spirit. And then of course, like if I'm right, all the drug use.
Yeah, and in that way you're meaning maybe, speaking in tongues and
speaking in tongues, rolling around on the floor, performing exorcisms, casting out devils, a lot of the stuff you would see on like a televangelist when they're doing all it. That's what early Mormon church actually looked like. And Joe, I kind of interpret as more or less a con man. So if it gives some context to the audience who's not familiar with it, I look at Mormonism kind of like the 19th century Scientology. And Joseph Smith was the L. Ron Hubbard of his era. He was writing really compelling Christian fan fiction that he kind of sold in his own twist to his audiences. And I think that's probably what makes it the most unique, is that it's a modern Christian religion, and it was kind of brought out whole cloth by this teenage boy in upstate New York.
Yeah, well, and kind of set that stage for us, like what was going on in New England where he was located at, but really kind of on the larger American religious stage at this period of time. I mean, are we kind of around the Great Revival or a little bit after? Like what was happening at this time?
So like we're kind of entering things right after the founding of the nation. We've kind of cast off the last century of witch burnings and a lot of the more superstitious things. So whereas witchcraft was kind of a contentious subject throughout history and you had to be very careful how you practiced it, people in America for probably the first time in history, or like European history, had the ability to kind of like experiment with what they thought was the occult, so long as they did it within Christian parameters. And that's kind of what the Smith family was birthed out of. Joseph's parents, Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack, got together in like I think 1800 or like right before 1800, and then just started having kids. And they were deeply meshed into the like Christian occult scene of New York, which was substantial. Everybody kind of had their own flavor. Everybody was kind of making their own church. Very few of which last today. It's the same area. The reason they call it the burned over area in New York is because so many Christian preachers had been through it that everybody had been baptized. It was burned over. Like everybody was Christian. Everybody was practicing their own version of Christianity. and like spiritualism kind of came out of this exact same area a generation later. Seventh-day Adventists, a lot of the big religions you think of as like American Christian religions came out of this one place in New York at the around the same time, which kind of bespeaks to how prevalent these like new American religions were at the time. Just not all of them had the staying power that Mormonism turned out to have. And so there were kind of itinerant preachers. There were snake oil salesmen. That's where that term comes from, is people leading revivals and selling snake oil, sometimes laced with drugs. And yeah, so like Joseph grew up in that area, and at that time he was kind of indoctrinated into some pretty deep forms of the occult, as well as some pretty esoteric interpretations of Christianity, while all these new American immigrants were asking themselves questions from like a theological perspective. So like, where did all the Native Americans come from? How does that fit into the Bible if the Bible is literally true? How does God look at these people or that? And Joseph's creation of Mormonism was in many ways an attempt to answer all of those questions in one place. And I think that's, sorry, I rant, but I think that's kind of the milieu that like Mormonism was birthed out of, and why it's so unique is he was trying to answer so many questions for so many people that had so many questions.
Yeah, and this was really interesting to me because I think, well, I hadn't given it that much thought, honestly, but my general idea, and maybe many of ours, was that although people were coming to America to escape religious persecution, that maybe I didn't totally grasp what that meant, or what kind of religion they wanted to do, or what types of things were happening in church that weren't happening in Europe and in many of the places that they were leaving. And I think, in reading your book, I had a broader understanding of what many of these beliefs were. And a lot of them really did align or connect with some of the earlier, I don't know that nature worship would quite be the right place to go with that, but maybe some of these things that witches had been burned for, as you were saying before, and much of that connecting with kind of plants or plant medicine or herbs, and how that all connected with religion and science and all of that. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of this is the cult in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. There were a group of German monks that came from Germany because their practices were too radical, or their philosophies. They came to America, specifically Pennsylvania, to practice their faith like unencumbered, and within a few generations built what many Mormons would recognize as Mormon tropes. So they called themselves the Brotherhood of Zion. They were very temple centric. They practiced a form of asceticism that included like dietary restrictions, and they believed in a 3-tiered heaven. They were this all kind of culminated in these temple rituals, which I believe kind of mirror the early days of Mormonism, where they were taking initiates into the upper rooms of the temple, and for like upwards of 30 days, putting them through a regimen of intense psychedelics every single day, where like towards the end of it, the last week of it, you're just gacked out seeing angels and talking to God, and you're given a new name, and he puts magic stones in your body and replaces some of your organs. Your teeth and hair fall out and are regrown, and you go through what we would today call a classic shamanic dissolution, where you're being rebuilt as a new celestial being. All tropes that would kind of strike with Mormons today, but this is like 100 years before Mormons were around, and this is in Pennsylvania, just a stone's throw from the Whitmer house, where the Whitmers were one of the founding families of Mormonism. And so this was like everybody had a group like Ephrata at that time that was operating, and if you knew what you were looking for, could tell what they offered. But if not, it just seemed like you were taking a magic sacrament. And I talk to God. That's all I really care about. So the another thing that we have to contextualize is like the mindset people had towards drugs at the time was very, they didn't have the war on drugs or a prohibition or any of that stuff. It was just like part of everything else. So like if a prophet could give you a sacrament and you an hour later saw God, a lot of people didn't really concern themselves with what actually made that happen. You know what I mean? They just know that I went to this guy, he has prophetic powers, he got me to see God. And so that's, I think, a huge part of the burned over district I was talking about is you have all these preachers who have all these different skill sets, and a lot of them are into mesmerism and early forms of hypnotism and drugs. And when you combine it all together, you have very charismatic people who can lead a lot of people in a visionary experience.
So this is really the environment that Joseph Smith Jr. grows up in, right? These are the people he is around. These are who his parents socialize with. This is the religion in some ways that he participates in growing up. So, I mean, tell us a little bit more about who he was kind of as a child and a teenager leading up to the founding of the church.
So his family was very poor growing up, even by the standards of the day. Like it's pretty regularly reported that most of the Smith kids like didn't have shoes and were just like kind of hick kids that were in the podunks of New York. But they got by through like farm work. They started their own like cake and beer shop on the side of the road where like if you were traveling you could just get refreshments and stuff. They were hustlers, and part of that hustling was their work in the occult. They would get hired. There were a lot of myths about buried, magically sealed or concealed treasures at the time, and there were what we would call today con artists, but back then they called themselves treasure diggers, who would basically magically scry in front of you, tell you that there's this lost mine of Spanish silver just in your property. It's going to take some work to get it out, but like me and my buddies, we're all magically, we know what we're doing. So like, just give us a couple weeks. You pay us to do the work, the digging work and stuff. And then afterwards, when we find this Spanish mine, I mean, that mine of silver is yours. So like paying us a few weeks to dig some holes isn't really a big deal, is it? And that's that's how a lot of men made their money, especially like the Smith family, who they will play it down. Joseph in his journals says that he was a treasure digger for something like a month, and it was blown out of proportion. But again, by his own accounts earlier, he was a treasure digger for over a decade and was actively the one scrying, which is the same methods he later used to translate, in quotes, the Book of Mormon. We can get into the discovery of that a little later, but essentially he was acting as the treasure digging group's virgin scryer, the person who would find the treasure and then tell you what had to be done magically to get it out. And then there was a nice caveat that if anybody broke protocol at all for any reason, the treasure could be lost. And so, of course, always the treasure was lost. Nobody ever found any treasure, which is why I call them con artists.
So did they have to stay ahead of their reputation? Because I imagine, like, how many times can you do that, you know, with your neighbors in a small town before everyone kind of figures out what's going on?
In most cases, not long. Part of the reason why you'll see with Mormon history that Joseph had to skip town every few years is because everybody eventually was onto him. And the few that were just like his zealous followers, the ones that didn't ask questions, those are the ones that stuck with him. And so by the end of this journey, he was surrounded by almost nothing but his zealous followers. And the dissenters were a lot easier to get rid of. To speak to that, when he was still a teenager, he was actually tried and found guilty for conmanship, for conning one of his neighbors out of a bunch of money. And it wasn't actually the neighbor who prosecuted him, it was the neighbor's sons and uncle. So like this dude's family saw Joseph milking him for everything he's worth, and they put out an arrest warrant because they saw, like, he's got my dad like in his hooks. My dad's never gonna think this guy's anything but magic. Clearly, we all know he's not, because he's never found anything and he's never going to. So they put an arrest warrant out for Joseph. Joseph was arrested, um, tried and found guilty, and then what they called leg bail. He basically escaped and skipped town and just didn't have to face repercussions until he started the church some years later, and a bunch of his neighbors were like, hey, we remember you. You don't get to go around calling yourself a prophet, and we also remember you never actually faced your you never faced punishment for the things you were convicted for. So he was rearrested as a prophet and like retried for the things he was tried for several years earlier. If that helps contextualize, like, a lot of his neighbors saw past it.
Yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of kind of anti-Mormon writing and views by community members when, he went from kind of being the treasure digger to the prophet, maybe as a way to avoid some of the pressure he was getting to to find this treasure that was never found.
And you'll get that a lot. The church has done, over the last 150 years, has done a great job of creating this false dichotomy of history where everything is either Mormon or anti-Mormon. There's no line in between where it's just, no, these are just people reporting on an obvious con man who, and they're not anti-Mormon. Actually, a lot of the Mormons that come out of the faith and then speak against Joseph aren't trying to destroy Mormonism. They're actually, a lot of them are trying to stay Mormon. They just think Joseph is a fallen prophet, and so they want Joseph out of the picture, and they all want to stay Mormon. So actually, it's tricky reading a lot of these perspectives, because some of these people are vehemently anti-Mormon, and they're like, no, this was created by a con artist. Like, again, like Scientology. People looked at it the same way, where you're like, why is this even a thing? This shouldn't be a thing. And then there were other people that were like, well, whatever, as long as everybody's a consenting adult, it's fine. But like, we should acknowledge that the dude who started it is a fallen prophet and an asshole. That doesn't necessarily make them anti-Mormon, just in my opinion makes them nuanced.
Sure, they were the people closest to really seeing what was going on. And so at some point, it is really interesting to me, though, that in some way that they believed he brought this information through, and they 100%, were believers in that, but they just couldn't believe in him anymore.
And this fit into the Christian mindset at the time. Like, there are characters in the Bible like King David, King Solomon. These are prophets of God who fell from grace because of their own human, like, whatever. And a lot of these people who were like, hey, you are marrying teenage girls and like bigamously marrying other men's wives and stuff, like, that's not really prophet stuff, is it? And like, I don't have a problem with Mormonism, but like, clearly you've fallen from grace. And that was there was room to believe prophets could do that. You know what I mean? You didn't have to believe prophets were perfect.
That totally makes sense. So, I mean, going back to kind of the family in general, what was their knowledge and kind of connection to herbal remedies, plant medicines, herbal healing, that type of thing? Like, how were they connected, and what were they doing with regards to that?
So a lot of, and this is where my work comes in, because there's already been historians that have established the Smith family's occult connections. The thing everyone kind of overlooks that I'm trying to really double down on is that all those books of occult learning that they clearly had access to and were using also have a lot of plant and botanical information in them, as well as here's how to make these plants into drugs that induce visions, and like, they're hand in hand. I think in terms of skill sets, we know that Lucy Mack, Joseph's mom, was a very gifted tarot reader, and she liked reading palms. Her and Porter Rockwell's mother apparently worked together for some time. Channeling was probably a type of activity they knew about, even though like spiritualism had not been created. There wasn't like the words for it, but like channeling dead ancestors or dead spirits is kind of what treasure digging involved. So there was a form of that going on. Joseph Sr., Joseph Jr.'s dad, Joseph Sr. was a very gifted scryer and diviner. He used to use scrying rods, what they would call rodsmen, where you take two rods and you like, a lot of people use it to find water nowadays. But he was apparently really talented with those. They even, before Joseph was born, Lucy Mack and Joseph Sr. joined a kind of a Christian divining rodsman cult that was waiting for the end of the world. And while they were waiting, they were treasure digging. They needed to find gold to pave the streets of heaven with. So they were all looking for gold. And that seemed to have been their skill set. Joseph, because of an illness when he was a child, I think it was a typhoid epidemic came through, developed a very bad leg infection, had to have leg surgery, which took several years to recover from. And he had to be either, he was immobile, he had to be carried or like helped to move because he couldn't put weight on that leg yet. And for most of his life, he walked with a noticeable limp or a cane. Because of that childhood injury. And so he had several older brothers, but like in a group that dug holes for a living, he wasn't much use. So he very quickly, as a young boy, found himself in the position of scryer, where all you have to do is looking at like scry and look to the other side to direct the treasure digging group, which he just happened to find himself in that position at like a very young preteen teenage boy. And he got very good at it very quickly. And for a decade, got to hone his skills as basically somebody who professionally directed men using occult language. So that when he eventually created the church and on demand was the mouthpiece of God, he was essentially doing the same thing he grew up doing. And so his skill sets were kind of an adaptation of both his mother and father. And in terms of like plant medicines and such, it was likely Lucy Mack that gave him a lot of that information, as well as some of his other like occult mentors or like people in his treasure digging group were sharing knowledge, of course. But I think by virtue of the fact that Lucy Mack had over a dozen children in the 1800s, and all of them survived out of childhood, as far as I can tell, infant mortality rates were, I think, over half. So by virtue of the fact that this woman kept all of her children alive, at least into their late teens, says that she at least had a working, competent knowledge of how to utilize plants. This is further highlighted by Joseph's first wife, Emma, who wrote a recipe to her son for like a datura salve, which is actually not psychoactive. The way she makes it, the end result is what would be a lot like today, like a Vicks vapor rub. It's like a chest thing for congestion. However, because datura is so dangerous to use, and if you pick it at the wrong time, and in order to make a safe version of that salve, you have to know how to not make the not safe version. So like we can kind of insinuate what they knew by what they did, even though what they did and what they talk about, like that salve, is pretty innocuous. It bespeaks a greater knowledge. Do you know what I mean? And so I think obviously like Emma had a lot of that. His mom, Lucy Mack, had a lot of that. I think Joseph picked up enough of it that with some mesmerism, with some scrying, with some that he made his own kind of form of profiting.
Yeah, and didn't was it Joseph Sr. that had the short-lived ginseng business, which I guess could have also benefited from being able to dig holes on people's properties?
Mm-hmm. Him and Lucy Mack processed something up towards of like, I think it was $3,000 worth of ginseng at the time, which today is like 70 some $1,000 worth of ginseng. It's a lot of ginseng. Through some bad business dealings, that kind of fell apart. But again, by virtue of the fact that they identified American ginseng, processed it, crystallized it, and prepped $70,000 worth of it, you knew how to handle plants. And similarly, a lot of historians have speculated that treasure digging activities were closely entwined with finding things like mandrake root, which has a whole occult method for extracting it safely. And then once it's extracted safely, you have mandrake root, which you can make a lot of psychedelic things with. And that may have been one of the treasures they were looking for. It's all kind of like tangential to each other, but like, again, if you're looking at this book of occult learning that teaches you how to scry for buried treasure and also talks about digging up mandrake root in a similar occult manner, you have to assume they at least read that section and had at one point looked for mandrake. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And really, even in looking into some of the books that you had mentioned that they probably had access to, you realize how much of it really is all intertwined, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
The astrology and the plants and the religion.
And you didn't
all.
really have to like have all of these books to do it. I mean, if you're in a group with 20 other people, you kind of have an occult co-op going where it's like, I have Ebenezer Sibley's book, and they're like, oh, I have Francis Barrett's book, we can swap and then we'll talk about it. And like, just because Joseph didn't have physical copies of these books that we know about doesn't mean he wasn't using them, you know?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So just trying to think, I have a note here to ask, where he learned kind of about alchemy and esoteric Christianity. But I think, unless there's something we missed there, it sounds like we've kind of covered what really led up to that.
It was a lot of it was familial. It was a lot of his like immediate family that was teaching him this, and he was doing it professionally. There is one other character worth mentioning named Lumen Walters, who was kind of a traveling occultist that had been through France and England, called himself a doctor, may have joined Mormonism for a short time afterwards, but was clearly influential in the early days of Mormonism, or pre-Mormonism, and like the starting of the church. There's a scene where like Joseph's old money digging associates, when he's starting the church, are coming after him because they're like, hey, we heard you found this gold book, and like, we all work together, and like, if you found treasure, we own a part of that. And there's this like weird wizard battle that ensues where they're scrying at each other for the hidden location of this gold book. And Lumen Walters, Joseph's old mentor, is one of those guys on the other side being like, hey, you owe us, man. And then a bunch of those guys who were looking for the gold Bible and like staged this like wizard battle eventually did join Mormonism. And some of those men's daughters became Joseph's polygamous wives. So it's interesting how many people may have been his mentor, you know. Lumen's just one of those, but he, after the whole Mormon thing, whether or not he joined Mormonism, he did leave the Ohio area, moved back to New York, and he opened up a tincture emporium, which at the time was about as close to a pharmacy as you could get. And so if one of Joseph's old teachers eventually opened a pharmacy using plant and occult magic, I would hazard a guess that Joseph picked up even a little bit of that.
He learned a thing or two and maybe more.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, really the founding of the church goes back a lot to these visionary experiences that Joseph had as a teenager. So what was happening in that period of time?
So this is where I get a little conservative in my speculation. There is room for individuals who are visionary, who can kind of induce these trance-like or visionary states on their own, on the natch, and don't need exogenous stimuli to do so. I am not one of those people. I tend to need a bit heavy-handed push to get me to do that. So I don't speculate too much on like Joseph's individual visionary experiences. what I like to focus on is more when he did so in a group and got everyone to see that, because then it's a lot harder to get people to share a vision. And it almost always includes some type of exogenous input, or like an outside catalyst. Um, During his teenage years, like when he was talking to Moroni the angel, originally he described it in more like treasure digging context. It wasn't an angel at first, it was a spirit. The spirit was guarding a treasure. His story kind of evolved over time, and so it's really hard to parse out any of it, and that I tend to not really speculate too hard on the truth or validity of his early visions. It's when he starts the church and like presents a vision for what they call the three witnesses or the eight witnesses. That's one of the first times I can pinpoint where he gets a small group together and gets them to share a visionary state, likely about an hour after a sacrament session where he gave them something. And all of these men more or less share the same vision over a period of time. And then you see this kind of evolution where he gets a bigger group together and a bigger group together and a bigger group together until you get to Kirtland in the 1830s, where he's leading an entire group of some 500 people, and he's dousing everyone in sacramental wine. He's telling you to drink as much as you want and that it can't get you drunk because it's consecrated by God. And then like an hour later, the entire place starts having visions. It's crazy. You know what I mean? I think those scenes are unambiguous psychedelic. Like he was lacing the wine. There's no other way to explain that in my mind. And I've yet to hear anybody's theories that would be able to explain those events other than he was lacing the sacramental wine. In fact, several of his general authority said nobody was having visions. It was all induced by wine. So we can get into some of his other early visions, but again, because it evolved so much, I'd end up telling 11 different versions of the same story. And
No,
he
that
may or
makes
may
sense.
not have used drugs.
And I think, what's also telling is that other local people who weren't members of the church were saying, like, it has to be drugged, right? Like the sacrament has to be drugged. That's what would explain this. And they were very much kind of looking into that, as far as I could tell.
Mm-hmm. There's one incident when they first get to Kirtland and start holding sessions. They would hold closed door sessions, which look a lot today like the Good Friday experiment. They would close all the windows and doors. They would get all the light out, and essentially they would, very in controlled settings, you would only have access to like hymns and images of God. And like, of course, you're going to direct people's visions when you limit their input that much and you get them all hopped up on something. So during these early years, when they first started doing these psychedelic sacrament sessions, one local school teacher named was J.J. Moss saw what they were doing, and the Mormons didn't know he was trained as a surgeon. He was working as a school teacher because he had a leg injury, much like Joseph, and couldn't walk everywhere. So he just worked in a schoolhouse. But he was trained as a surgeon. And he went to one of their sacrament sessions and got them to give him the sacrament, and immediately was like, oh, I know what's in this. And you're not fooling anyone. And he I think at one point even tried to steal a bottle of their wine so we could take it home and analyze it, but was foiled. And then like 20 some years later, on two separate occasions, gave very detailed accounts of what he thought was going on. So yes, my theory is nothing new. I'm just trying to give a platform for these people who've been saying this the whole time.
Right. Some of these things kind of got smoothed over or lost to history, but they've been there all along and been available for those looking for them.
Yes.
So I mean, when we get to this point where there's now a church, Joseph is the prophet, how is he recruiting people? How are people being convinced to come to the church?
That's honestly very conventional. It's a lot like every other religion at the time. actually, some of the frustration they had in the early days of the church were that people weren't buying the Book of Mormon because it was just like everything else, and like they weren't listening to us. And I think the thing that separated them was the sacrament sessions. You have a bunch of people who grew up around Pentecostalism. They grew up around this kind of radical Christianity. So like you rolling around on the floor isn't going to convince me of anything. Like, can you give me a vision? Like, are you an actual prophet? And the fact that Joseph and a lot of his hierarchy could take you into a room and give you the sacrament, and, you know, a day later you emerge kind of wide-eyed and like, oh my God, it's real. And yeah, I'll read your book. Okay, I'll read your book. You want my money? All my money. And I think that was his biggest success, was for he was delivering an experience to people that they wanted and they were pursuing most of their lives. Whether or not he did that nefariously, they didn't really care about. They just at the time knew that I've found the guy that has the answers, apparently, and he seems to have the power of a prophet. You know what I mean? And I think that's where a lot of Joseph's success was. Aside from the fact that he was very charismatic, he was a good-looking younger guy. He kind of had like a backwoods twang as an accent. So he was like one of the people's people. He was very charming. He was very easy to get along with. He didn't look like you know, a learned scholar, which was kind of his like, well, look at the guy, he's kind of a country bumpkin, how could he have translated that entire book? And like he had this whole mystique about him, which I think kind of helped his ploy as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, if you're offering to people that, you know, you're going to have a direct experience with God, and then you do, like, I think you're right. Like, okay, fine, I'll give you all my money. You know, no big deal.
And this is you again have to remember that like they didn't go through the 1960s. While occultists and a select group of people were very learned about a lot of these things, their average Joe was just like, I'm a farmer. I go to church every Sunday, and then you go to church one Sunday and you see God. You know what I mean? And you're just like, I don't care. I don't care what. I don't care if it was in the sacrament. I don't care if it was in the air. Whatever you did, like, keep it coming. I think was the big sell point.
Yeah, and I mean, were there other promises that he was making to converts in those early days, or was that, you know, really what the promise was? You'll have a direct experience with God.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely some more promises. The reason they call themselves the Latter-day Saints is because like Mormonism is an apocalyptic religion. They like Jesus is going to be here any second now. And I think, and especially in like the early days of Mormonism, Joseph believed Jesus was going to come that generation. Like, and he was telling everybody this. And so another big sell point was like, yo, when Jesus comes, you're going to have a high point in the kingdom of heaven because you're on the right side. We're the guys with the truth and all the truth and nothing but the truth. So like when Jesus comes, you're in the in circle. And if you're in my inner circle, you're going to have a great place in the 1,000-year reign of Jesus when he comes.
Yeah, and this was so interesting. And I think I told you about this when we had talked before, but, you know, really my experience in visiting some of these Mormon cemeteries was how confused many of these spirits were, because although the church had very much lined out, like, this is what's going to happen when, you know, after you die, when you go to heaven, because there was this piece of like, well, but when Jesus comes back, right? All these things are going to happen when Jesus comes. And what I was coming across were all these spirits who were still standing around basically waiting for Jesus, because it was like that one little, you know, hitch in the
we don't get to move on till that guy shows up.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's just very interesting looking at, you know, how our beliefs color that experience after we pass away, which we don't, you know, always think through. We have our beliefs in life, but how do they carry us into the afterlife? So yeah, really interesting that they were, and, you know, connecting even with many of my, you know, pioneer time ancestors was still that kind of early time of Jesus is going to come back any time now. So they were, I mean, I think I don't know, maybe that seems scarier to me, but maybe not, that Jesus is coming back in this lifetime. But I guess it's more a matter of prepare yourself, right? Like be in the right place at the right time.
Exactly. And they were so by the act of creating what they called Zion, or like God's city on earth, they were kind of expediting that process. So there was even in that first generation of Mormonism, and since afterwards, honestly, but really especially in that first generation, they were actively trying to bring on the apocalypse. And a lot of their acts as Mormons are in like trying to establish God's church was so that Jesus would come sooner.
Like what kind of things?
Like the creation of the temple. There's a bunch of so like there's a bunch of scenes where Joseph will have a revelation and be like, oh, this is one of the signs. This is one of the signs that means he's just about to come, guys. We're almost there. And he conveniently used those moments when everybody was kind of like, rah, 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 rah. I don't know if Joseph really knows what he's talking about. He had a good knack for when the flock was going astray, and he had a good way of bringing them all back in. It's like, whoa, 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 guys, you remember Jesus is coming. You gotta, like, here's one of those signs. You gotta come back.
Yeah, well, shifting gears just a little bit, although I think it still follows along with the plants and the plant medicine type of things. Can you tell us a little bit about what the word of wisdom is and how it pertains to kind of the sacrament?
Um, so the word of wisdom was introduced during the Kirtland years. I've said that city a few times. Kirtland, Ohio is one of the first places they migrated to, kind of established this place that would be God's chosen, place on earth. And consequently, when they moved there a year before, Kirtland had started a bunch of temperance societies. So the city was kind of split into this temperate, not temperate thing, like many frontier towns. And so the word of wisdom was kind of it. It was largely plagiarized from early Quaker anti-temperance or pro-temperance movements, where it was like, if you're not going to drink, here's also a good way. This is what you should eat. This is how you should eat. This is just like what a good diet regimen is. This is what this is what creates healthy people. And the word of wisdom is largely taken from those early pamphlets. But I believe Joseph's spin on it had two effects. It was one, largely to quiet the temperance movements in Kirtland, to make the Mormons look temperate, because there are all these rumors going around that you guys are doing crazy stuff in your sacraments. So he offered that as like, no, we're just like you. We follow the word of wisdom. It's and originally it was not an obligation. It was just like a suggestion, but it was good PR. It made us look wholesome and quaint. The second effect, I believe, was the word of wisdom contains a lot of loopholes which allow for quiet administration of psychedelic plants. So for example, Mormons are infamously not allowed to drink coffee or tea or caffeine or of any kind. It says a hot drink is not good for the belly in the word of wisdom. So that's where all the Mormons not drinking coffee comes from. They don't drink alcohol or wine because it similarly says that you're not allowed to drink strong drink. However, it does say that you can drink barley drinks of your own make. And I don't know what else you make barley drinks out of other than beer. And it does say you can make wine of the vine as long as it is of your own make and consecrated for the purposes of God. So like, you can drink as much as you want as long as it's yours. As well as he specifically says every plant and herb of the earth is a wholesome thing made by God and is made for our consumption. So in this one document, you have a thing that makes you look like a wholesome, quaint group that doesn't drink or do anything wrong, but creates a bunch of really convenient loopholes for psychedelically laced beers, psychedelically laced wines, mushrooms, datura, like whatever you want to use, as long as you consecrate it, it's okay. And that's how they viewed it back then. Today, it's this whole different thing, and they've kind of redefined what it means, and nobody really does the drinking or wine or any of that, even though like a lot of early Mormons did make their own wine.
That was one of the things that surprised me in research for this season as well, is how much wine was being made in Utah in
Oh
the
my
early days.
God, yes. The wine and brothel industry in Utah was a booming when in Brigham's days. That's how they made a lot of their money, actually, was the brothels and the wine.
Yes, yes. And I think at one point he had to tell one of the wards, or, groups within Utah, to stop making and sending so much wine, because it was like too much. They were too
And it's making us
successful.
look bad. Like, it's okay to just like do it discreetly and make a buck on the side, but like, we're not going to be the Mormon winemakers. Like, don't do that.
Right. And that's kind of evolved to today. I mean, the word of wisdom is still a thing and still followed by Mormons today, but it's much more, I would say,
And
strictly
it's more of a
enforced.
law and less of a suggestion. Back then it was like, we're just doing this to keep the temperance people happy. But today it is like, that affects your temple recommend. That affects like what kind of Christian magic you get to do in the Mormon temples.
Yeah, so interesting. Well, what are some of the plants? I mean, we talked about a couple of them, but what would Joseph had been familiar with at that time when it comes to psychoactive or psychedelic type plants or medicines, and what did he have access to?
So a big mistake I think people make when they're speculating about like drugs in history is a lot of people try and find a single answer solution. My biggest problem with like Dr. Becksed's paper when I first read it was like, he was all about Amanita and Datura. And I was like, of course he would use way more than that. And it was seasonal, and like, he didn't always have access to that. Although he could, like, now I don't discount that he could have, and Datura was probably one of his big herbs. I think the biggest thing that decided what he was using in his wine was seasonal availability, geographical availability, because he kept moving towns. So like, when you move towns, you got to figure out like, okay, what grows locally here? Does anyone have a garden that has these herbs in it? I do think if you're looking for like a grouping of plants that were most likely the ones he was using most of the time, they would be what would be called the hexing or witches herbs. That's kind of largely Datura, belladonna, hemlock, henbane. Everybody has like their own grouping of it, but generally there's about 5 of them. And then mushrooms, of course, but again, very seasonally, probably only twice a year he would have had access to them if he knew how to find them. But coincidentally, the mid 1800s are about when mycology was becoming a thing, and so like people were starting to identify and taxonomically categorize mushrooms, and a lot of the occultists and alchemists at the time already knew what psychedelic mushrooms were. So that's a possibility. I hate to try and pin anything down, because like, until we get Joseph's secret black drug book, or like any of the general authorities like secret diary entries come out and say like, we were totally harvesting Datura, it's hard to say. But speaking to Lucy Mack's high success with having children at the time, ergot was used as a uteroconstrictive agent during childbirth. And women who used it, like midwives who used ergot, knew what the off-label side effects were. So they knew, I'm going to give this to you because I need everything. I need you to have this baby safely. I know if I give you too much, you're going to have visions. And I know if I give you way too much, there's serious consequences. So these women really knew how to use ergot safely, which is surprising because it's a very, very dangerous plant or fungi to use. But I think that's another likely candidate that we just don't really have the ability to validate whether or not that was really being used. But given the prevalence of things like that in German folklore and German medicine, and the German ties to Joseph's family, probably another likely one.
Yeah, and you know what, I was thinking about this a little bit this morning too, and just had this like thought pop into my head that, like, of course they wouldn't just use one thing that anyone could find in their garden, right? Because then how would that make what they were doing special? Like, there was so much ego, I think, wrapped up in
Yes.
like, what Joseph Smith was doing, that like, of course he would have had his own special brew that was just his, that he had perfected after maybe trying a little of this and a little of that. And so I think you're right, between seasonal availability, which, you know, if they had enough of something and could dry it maybe they would have had it all year, but still that's like, oh, hopefully we had a good mushroom flush if we're talking about
Well,
mushrooms.
and that also, I think that also accounts for why you only see a couple of times, like 500 people get hopped up on Sacramento wine. It takes a lot of material to get that many people high. And so, of course, like we can get into the school of the prophets, but in the early days, they started the sacrament ceremonies. They had to kind of like put a censorship on them because it was leaking what they were doing. And so now it was kind of only for the Mormon hierarchy. And then it slowly started getting more and more restricted. And until there were things like the temple ceremony where they were like, okay, all of you are going to have visions now. Those are very few. And I think it's because it took so much material to actually do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I think, you know, it also kind of follows, if you really look at, you know, entheogen use through just the dawn of time, right? And religion is that, you know, it was something that everybody did. And then as time went by and the churches became more formalized and religion became, you know, then it gets the priestly class only, and very, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and at some point is kind of gets taken out altogether, that there is a medium that is causing these visions, right? That it's not
Yeah.
just you're going and laying down in a special room and God comes and talks to you. Like that there's something that causes this to happen for most people.
Mm-hmm. And there's other things to consider as well. Like I don't want to say his John C. Bennett, I believe his name was, one of Joseph's general authorities. I'll have to I'm, I think it's John C. Bennett. One of Joseph's higher authorities in his inner circle towards the end of everything in like Illinois. This man was an obstetrician. He delivered babies. He was also a big part of Joseph's polygamy. And we have several quotes from him essentially explaining why Joseph's polygamous unions didn't result in children. Because he says, I have a thing that can, he's trying to coerce another woman into marrying him. And he tells her, I have a potion that can keep you from having babies. The same potion administered correctly can also kill your husband if you want me to, which in
Wow.
terms of occultism, you generally have, if you have a certain kind of magical concoction, you can, like, one dose is a visionary dose, two doses is like a purge dose where you're having visions but you're also purging, like in ayahuasca, and then like a third dose would be an overdose and you run the risk of dying. The purge dose can also be used as an abortive agent. So when he says things like that, he's basically showing his cards and being like, I'm kind of a magic doctor and I can make a potion that can get rid of your baby and also get rid of your husband too. It's the same potion, just different doses.
Yeah, and that really speaks to how close that thinking and those ideas were to Joseph Smith, even though he, you know, as you say, we don't have the black book, the diary, you know, admitting such things, but presumably he knew what this doctor was telling his potential future wives.
Well, probably that was his private abortion doctor. That's what I speculate. And you know, we have to come up with a reason why all of these women he was clearly having sex with, um, most of them didn't have any babies afterwards.
Right, right. Because early he
Although
was probably,
several of them thought that they did. There were several women who were married to other men while they were having sex with Joseph and were convinced that their children were Joseph's. Later DNA results have shown that they were not, but by virtue of the fact they thought those kids were Joseph's means they were having sex. And, you know, there's a lot to it.
children could have resulted from that relationship, because early on he was talking about these as being spiritual marriages, right? That he wasn't having sex with them.
I think that was kind of a later addition. I think that was he had kind of a weird MO when it came to finding wives. He usually liked young girls that worked in his house, like young teenage girls. And then he would approach them with like a secret revelation, like, hey, God told me about this secret thing that like only you and I know about. And it's weird. I don't really know if I want to do it, but like he says we should get married. And then like he would have one of his friend authority higher guys in his hierarchy act as his wingman and basically badger this poor girl until like, hey, you know, like this is a secret sacred thing, and like I know it's weird, but like we have to do our part, and we don't always understand God's plan, and blah 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 blah. And in some cases they even got the family's permission to be like, hey, this is a secret revelation for your family only. The prophet needs to marry your daughter for celestial reasons. And like I think it was pretty unambiguous what was going on until he got caught. And then all the celestial marriage came out where it's like, oh, this is celestial. I'm not having sex with anybody. Even though Emma, his first wife, found him and one of his teenage maids rolling around in the hay. Like, I think that was an excuse he came up with later to try and cover his tracks.
That makes sense, because he kept that a secret for quite some time, or some version of a secret.
Yep.
Like years, right?
He was actually he was married to and having an affair with Fanny Alger, his teenage maid, for I think 3 years, living in the same house before Emma found out, and then kicked this girl out in this giant scene in the middle of the night. And now the whole Mormon town's like, oh, what happened? And she kind of goes off in disgrace and moves to another town, and like it's pretty obvious what was going on.
Yeah,
especially right under your nose for like 3 years. That's got to be a big blow for Emma.
Right. Well, okay, we could go down that hole.
Sorry. Yeah. Don't get me started on polygamy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if we have time at the end, maybe. But I do, before we talk about, because I do want to talk about the dedication of the Nauvoo temple, because I think there was a lot of telling things that happened there. But I do want to kind of dip in a little bit to talk about Freemasonry. So, I mean, when did Joseph become a Freemason, and how did he get through the levels as quickly as he did?
Okay, so this is where things again get a little tricky and murky. Joseph, on the books, technically did not become a Mason until the 1840s, when they arrived in Nauvoo, or when there was a Nauvoo chapter of Freemasons that was formed among the Mormons, and Joseph became he rose to the rank of Master Mason in I think like 2 days, which that takes years to do. Given the fact that there's some ties to Masonry before Joseph was even born. His older brother Hiram is named after the patriarch of Masonic legend. Hiram Abiff is the first Mason that worked on the Temple of Solomon and was killed for not divulging his secrets. And so part of Masonic initiation rituals is to recreate this death of Hiram Abiff. Joseph's brother is named Hiram. That's coincidental, is it not? Also coincidental is one of the first exposés written on Masonic initiation rites, written by a guy named Morgan. I can't remember his name. He published one of the first exposés on Masonry, published all of their initiation rites essentially, and then was, quote, disappeared. He apparently was mugged on the road and killed, but like everyone knows that the Masons killed him because he did this. And coincidentally, Joseph married his widow, Morgan's widow, married her later, and she became one of Joseph's polygamous wives before he became a Mason. So like Joseph's tie to Masonry, and especially the Smith family's tie to Masonry, is probably very deep and a lot longer than we give credit for. And by virtue of the fact that Joseph rose to the rank of Master Mason in 2 days, means that he knew all of the stuff. So like if you want to join Masonry and you know all the initiation signs, you know the history, you know all the handshakes and the passwords and all, like you can do that. You just have to know everything already. And I think that's why he rose so quickly. similar to Masonic initiation, or similar to Mormon initiation, Masonic initiation. There's a lot of evidence for early drug use during like the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, up until about the 18th century. What probably stopped Masons from doing that was there was a satanic panic of the 1800s where like the Masons were the child eating Satan. Like in the 80s, it was D&D kids were the ones that were going to kill everyone and eat your babies. In the 1880s, the Satan epidemic was all the Masons, they're going to take over the government and kill all your children. And that's kind of what I think put a kibosh on all the psychedelic initiations among the Masons. If you're interested in that angle, I would highly recommend a book by P.D. Newman. He has several books out that all deal with like the occult and drugs, specifically Masonic initiation and their use of all sorts of drugs.
I'll make a note so I can link that for people. Do you know what the name of the book is?
I think it's The Secret. God, it's been so long. It's up on my shelf.
That's it. I mean, his name's probably unusual enough. I can track it down.
It's a secret teach. I'm gonna kill myself. I've cited him a million times in my book. It's driving me nuts. I'm sorry.
No worries. I will look it up and track it down and confirm with you if I need to. Well, so tell us, and because he obviously was so well versed in, Masonic tradition, what are some of the similarities between Masonic initiation and, Mormon temple rites?
This is not admittedly my area of expertise, but kind of briefly, the temple garments, the apron that you wear in the temple, a lot of the initiation garments are very, very similar, especially the early ones. We've kind of slowly evolved the Mormon temple garments, but especially the very first ones are almost page for page a plagiarism of Masonic initiation. And the reason for that is I say plagiarism, but the reason for those similarities is because both Masonry and Mormonism were trying to recreate the initiation ceremonies that happened in Eleusis, or Solomon's Temple, or what have you. They were both trying to kind of recreate the same ancient esoteric rituals. And so that's why I think there are so many commonalities, aside from the fact that Joseph created his after he'd been influenced by the Masonic ones. But they were both trying to kind of recreate the same stuff, if that helps.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, the Mormon temple experience, from what I understand, is supposed to be really walking you kind of step by step through ascension to heaven, right? But while you're still on earth and while you're still alive. So it's interesting because in doing my research, I came across, lots of ex-Mormons who really had just shared how underwhelming the temple experience was after, years of buildup. So, do you think, based on your own experience with the temple and whatnot, like how different would it have been if you were under the influence of an entheogenic substance while in the temple?
Well, I can say, aside from the psychedelic substances, the early Mormon temple rituals, based on the comparative studies I've done of like what they do then versus what they do today, the early Mormon temple rituals were very theatrical and they look like a lot of fun, honestly. There's a guy that comes in dressed as the devil and he's writhing around on the floor, tempting you. And there's like, it's crazy and it's good theater. It looks like fun. I can see why people are underwhelmed today. And then if you throw psychedelics in on top of that, it's just like, oh my God, this is crazy. So I can't, and I never went through the modern higher levels of the temple. So I can't really speak to that. I only went to the temple while I was 12 to 17-ish, where they let you in like the lower levels of the temple. I've just read about them. I can see why people are underwhelmed today, because like, so for example, you have in the beginning, you have like a guy dressed as Satan rolling around on the floor. You're stripped naked in front of a bunch of strangers. There's a guy that touches your balls, that's putting oil at weird points of your body. They like, the whole experience is psychedelic on top of the fact that you're likely being given psychedelics. Versus today, where you have this very strange garb where you're like, you're kind of naked on the sides, but not totally. And there's, yes, the strangers touch you. It's more awkward than like a pageant. Like it used to be a big thing. And now it's just kind of like this awkward, bureaucratic business interaction where here's the handshake, here's the secret word, here's your secret name. Now you get to go to heaven. And everyone's like, oh, that's it. Okay. Whereas like in the 1800s, you were just like, yeah, oh my God, there's no Satan, no. And you like you had this whole thing where you had to interact and talk with Satan, and it was all staged, and it's good theater. I I think that's probably the biggest thing I could see. But again, I never went through that. So.
Okay. So do you think that was largely the experience during the Nauvoo temple dedication? I mean, thousands of people came to that ceremony, right?
So there's different, there's the Kirtland temple dedication. They actually never, Joseph never got to see the Nauvoo temple dedicated. They were almost finished building it when he died.
I got this mixed up then, yeah.
It's all right. It's fine. Inside baseball, weird stuff. But in Kirtland, so they had like the temple dedication, where that's where all the psychedelic stuff is. They had like a big main room of the temple, and then there were different levels of the temple that you could go to perform different ceremonies. And basically the dedication ceremony of the temple was to be like, this temple's open and we're consecrating it to God, and now we get to do all the secret rituals and stuff. Even though Joseph and his hierarchy had been doing secret rituals in the completed temple for months before the dedication. But the dedication essentially was just bringing in some 500 people who were there and had helped build it, consecrating it for use for the Lord, and then emptying a barrel of psychedelic wine into these parishioners. And then about an hour later, they all, while the hierarchy is delivering speeches and prophecies in tongues and doing backflips and vomiting into the pews, like it got crazy real quick. But it was kind of just like more or less a hopped up normal session of church. They didn't really do any special ceremonies. That was more for Joseph's hierarchy in private months before, who had been doing like the anointing rituals where they bathed each other in likely psychedelic oils and stuff.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about the anointing very much or at all, really. And I think that's a piece that has survived in the church today, although not nowhere in the same way, maybe than it was in the early. But what was the, I guess, the process or the point or the idea around the anointing?
So I'm not entirely sure what I see it as just another vehicle for them to be using psychedelics. There's a bunch of things that kind of overlap, where Joseph is saying this is a ritual that was performed by Christ that kind of gives you special access or dispensation to other kingdoms or other things in heaven. You can use that to explain it, but I think by and large, this is just another vehicle that I want to try out. And maybe he hadn't had access to what they called witches' ointments or flying ointments. But again, that's a thing that is talked about all the time in these grimoires. Very few recipes actually remain, which is probably why he may never have tried them. And then finally, when he got to Kirtland and he met somebody that knew how to make them, and he was like, oh, let's incorporate this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so the Kirtland dedication then kind of had all kinds of flavors of, the wine.
And I see the incorporation of the anointing oils is just like, that's a new toy he got to play with. And he found a spot in the ceremony to put it. But I am a pessimist, I think.
It lives on and continues, at least in some way. Now it's the consecrated olive oil or
And similarly, you were talking about the temple rituals. When you, one of the things that changed when Brigham took over is there was a point in the upper part of the temple where you got your special name, you got your handshakes and the passwords and everything, and then you were supposed to eat something and have an experience. When Brigham took over, we don't know what you ate. There's no, that's been thoroughly censored and taken out of church history. All I can dig up so far is that whatever it used to be, Brigham replaced it with raisins or grapes. And you just ate raisins or grapes after that. But again, you have to take, like, anytime somebody's eating something, anytime anybody's rubbing oil on each other, you have to, like, okay, there's that could be something. It may not be anything, but
there could be something there, something deeper.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, really kind of coming to the end of Joseph's life, there was a lot of kind of chaos after he was killed, and obviously lots of factions of members went in a lot of different directions, but it seemed like primarily the visionary experiences ended or significantly declined after his death. So, I mean, what do you attribute that to, if in fact the leadership knew that's what had been going on and had been participating in it up until that point?
See, and again, I think at that point, a lot of people did see Joseph as a fallen prophet. So you see everybody splinter group in kind of their own way. Brigham most famously took everybody to Utah. Sorry, my dryer's going off. It's a very long buzzer. So Brigham famously brought everybody to Utah. There were also several other prospective sites that they were looking at for Zion. One was in Mexico. One was in, I think San Francisco was even being considered at the time. And there was another one in Beaver Island. But essentially when they schismed, you can see like the Strangites who followed this guy Strang, who said that Joseph gave him a secret revelation that he was going to be in charge next. He didn't. It was all plagiarized. He took a huge group of Mormons down to this area in Beaver Island or Beaver Creek Island. I can't remember. But they were still doing drugs, and they were still using a lot of Joseph's old tricks of like getting people to dress in angel drag and go up on a mountain and pretend to talk to you, and they would paint themselves in phosphorus. It was, again, a lot of pageantry, good theater. They were using drugs to kind of amplify that. But much like Joseph, this dude went a little power hungry and was murdered at the hands of his parishioners. It's happening again. I think that, like, Brigham was a businessman. He was a very keen businessman. And I think the way he saw the church surviving was like a businessman would. Like, we need to get rid of all the radical stuff. We need to be this thing that looks like, he was a good PR guy. So like, we need to look like these kind of Mormons, even though, like you said, in Utah, the wine industry was booming, but like, we're Mormons. We don't drink, but we can make it and send it to you guys. It was like, there was a very definitive shift in like how the church was operated and how it was presented to the public. And similar, a lot of those other offshoots, I haven't really been able to follow because there were too many of them. But the large body of the LDS that went with Brigham, he flat out burned books and recensored history. So it was very easy for him to take a spin and make Mormonism whatever he wanted. Everything else that is kind of blanketed under FLDS or fundamental latter Mormonism is kind of hard to parse out because there's so many versions of it. It is interesting that like Emma Smith, Joseph's first wife, because she was in, Joseph had said for years that his first son would be the person to take over the church. When he died, his son was still a kid. And so obviously like someone was going to have to take over. And for a lot of the mafia stuff that was happening in the Mormonism at the time, Emma very rightly was in fear of her life because she's like, somebody just needs to kill me and this kid and they can take over the church. So she fled with some of her loyal followers to another area, and like a lot of the FLDS stuff kind of came out of that. Um, and that's why they still kind of adhere to the idea that Mormonism should be a hierarchy. That's where you get into the weird stuff like Warren Jeffs and everything. But it's a weird coincidence where, again, I think Emma kind of also saw that we need to get rid of some of the radical stuff. And so she perhaps toned down some of the other things, because Joseph's son doesn't seem to be aware of any of the drug stuff. He grew up outside of Joseph's world. He grew up out after all this schism stuff happened, and he grew up in a form of Mormonism that was kind of more focused on the polygamy than anything. And so it's even more weird that his son, Joseph's grandson, Frederick M. Smith, who was running around in the early 1900s, was one of the first psychologists that was trained at, I think, Columbia. He was one of the first like guys that was a certified psychologist. He on his own discovered peyote and was like, oh my God, we should be incorporating this into Mormonism. This is a great tool. And he was kind of quietly tolerated by his local LDS people because he was a prophet. He was a prophet of the FLDS church. So you have a sitting Mormon prophet who is a certified psychologist, really into peyote, and he's writing about it. Is amazing. But he seems to be completely ignorant of the fact that the early days of what they used to do. He doesn't write about it like there's any connection. Like he discovered this on his own, which says to me that that schism kind of like shut that out the same way that Brigham did. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but there's there's so many different ways this happened, and consequently they did find drugs again, but later, and then everyone quietly ignored him, and so it never really became a thing until late. It's a hard question to answer.
That makes sense, but it does. I mean, for one reason or another, it kind of, that visionary time really kind of ends, and what you have by the time the group is in Utah and there's, massive immigration coming from Europe, there is kind of that question of what was the appeal if this visionary piece was missing, right? That was so important in the early days. And obviously, the promise of land and starting a new life and doing all of those things was, can't be understated. But I wonder how much people were influenced by those who had had visionary experiences, who were probably still around and in the church.
Well, that was definitely happening. A few of the people that made it to Salt Lake kind of were quietly operating not their own little sect of Mormonism, but like Brigham kind of seems to have tolerated, like William Clayton was Joseph's private secretary. He was the guy that hid a lot of the stuff that we didn't know about until like 100 years later, like Joseph's kind of weird Batman villain plan to take over the US with an army of Native Americans, like very weird, but like he was the guy that hid all that. So the likelihood that he hid other stuff is very high. It is interesting that when he went to Utah with Brigham seems to have like quietly tolerated his weird esotericism, because like Clayton immediately starts an alchemical society, and starts like operating this alchemical lab with a few of his friends, and this alchemical society lasted until the 1880s as far as I can tell. So there are quiet groups of Mormons still doing this very, very quietly and privately, and how much of that incorporates drugs, who knows? But it was likely the guys that came with Joseph from Joseph that helped translate that and helped it survive in whatever form that it did. There were also in Utah kind of private speakeasy pharmacies that were designated by an all-seeing eye, and it said holiness to the Lord. And as long as you knew the passcodes and stuff, you could essentially gain access to illicit materials in Utah that were, wine. If you wanted to buy a barrel of wine that is not okay for you to drink, but we made it, so it's wink, wink, kind of okay. If you go to the right place and know who to talk to, you can get a barrel of wine. And as long as you're not causing a problem, as long as we don't have to sanction you for anything, as long as you're doing it privately in your own home with your own stuff, we don't care. Seems to have been largely the attitude, at least for a little while in Utah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure it didn't just end overnight, just immediately. So,
It was
yeah.
nothing official, but I do think little pockets of it maybe still existed.
We started to get into the plural marriage a little bit, but I think I would be interested in just talking about that a little bit more if you have the time, just specifically on, like as that was happening, because it did continue going, or it did continue into Utah and into these other factions as well. And so, like, where was that coming from? How, we have some of the stage set on what Joseph maybe was or wasn't doing and how he was getting to that, but how did it continue? And like, what was the expectation of men or women in the church with regards to plural marriage?
So this is much like the drugs, and this is why I think there's room for the drugs to stay secret, is largely the polygamy stayed secret. And most of the revelations about polygamy were at the time secret. So like while Joseph was alive, he was vehemently denying that he practiced polygamy. And he would, all his hierarchy were just like, we don't do that. That's crazy. What are you guys talking about? But they were totally polygamists and marrying. Like Joseph was very famous for asking people if they'd marry him. They'd say no, or their husband would get upset. He'd send their husband on a mission for 2 years, and then he'd marry their wife, shtup their wife the whole time, and then like that was when he came back. It was like, oh, this is your Abrahamic test. God was testing you to see how faithful you are. And there's no documentation for any of it. Like we know that Joseph had about 40 wives, maybe upwards of 80. It's like who knows. And then when he died, some of his wives were married by Brigham. So like several of Brigham's wives used to be Joseph's wives, and it's all very convoluted. So when you get into the post Joseph era, you have like weird secret revelations that we don't know if it really came from Joseph or if everyone just thought it came from Joseph. But there was like a revelation that said no one could enter the very top kingdom of heaven as a man unless you were a patriarch, you had the priesthood, and you had at least 3 wives. Why? Who knows? But that was just a thing everybody was really focused on. And at least 3 wives was, it was a way of saying like, if you have more wives, that's just more blessings. So then people take that out of control and start marrying their kids, and like it gets gross real quick. And a lot of the times Mormons were put into a tight spot was because they just couldn't keep it secret anymore, even though like there's no documentation for it. Everybody knew what they were doing. It's like when you show up to the grocery store with 10 women and like 1 million kids, like doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. Or like when traveling senators are in Utah and they're just like, why does everybody have like 10 wives hanging around? It's hard to keep that under wrap, even though we don't know these people's names. And that lasted up until I think the early 1900s was when the Supreme Court finally said like, hey, you got to stop marrying extra wives because that's not what we do, or we're going to take your tax exempt status. And much like Joseph, it was like, oh, wait, I just got a thing from God that says we don't do that anymore. So, but this happened, I think 3 times where the Supreme Court was like, you guys got to stop doing this. They said, oh, publicly, we don't do that anymore. We actually never did it. And then they all kept doing it. And that's when you get into this weird thing with like the FLDS, where like anybody could be Mormon, but like if you wanted to go do your thing, you could call yourself fundamentalist and then just go live in the hills and do whatever you wanted, and nobody would really bother you. It's not really my area, but it's inherently hard to talk about because all of it was undocumented. It did remain secret for so long, even though it was like an open secret, like everybody knew what you were doing. I think the drugs were largely the same thing. It's just after Joseph's death, they kind of had to pick which one they were going to hold on to. And enough of these guys were weird old perverts that they're like, I'd rather have 1 million wives. Thank you. And I mean, the early 1920s is, I think, when that starts to really die out in the mainstream, even though like today, the standing LDS prophet has two wives. He's married to one wife who died and he's sealed to an eternity. And he's also married to this new wife who he's also sealed to an eternity. So even though he has one earthly wife, he's still practicing polygamy. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah, I that question came across my mind too, about like how complicated does this get with the church being so obsessed with these sealings, right? And families being together. And I came across it in my own family's temple records where I'm like, is this a record of polygamy without saying it's polygamy? Like there's these random children that don't, like, where did they come from, that are
mm-hmm,
sealed to, like, not their parents but their parents, and
mm-hmm.
so I'm like, is that what's happening here, or is or is this just like, oh, one wife died and then and then the next one.
That's also a possibility. For example, the Mountain Meadow massacre, when they killed all those women and children, they didn't kill the kids that were younger than 8 because they couldn't make decisions on their own. They weren't of the age of accountability. So those kids were actually just kind of like adopted by local Mormon families and made to be Mormon. And so that, like, yeah, there were circumstances where just like somebody died and somebody had to take you. So we took you and now you're Mormon and we sealed you and you're ours now. Um, so again, it's hard to tell. There are a million circumstances where like that could have been why that happened. But also, yes, polygamy was a very good way of like secretly documenting polygamy.
Yeah, it's certainly, I actually have it sitting here on my desk, just the one of the page that I had printed out, but it's like, he's got multiple wives on here, but the paperwork seems to make sense of like one died, another one, got married very quickly afterwards, but there's like their actual kids, and then there's like these other kids that don't totally belong, but we're all sealed, together at the same time. And so, yeah, there's some interesting things that you start looking and realizing, oh yeah, they wanted to document it, but they didn't want to document it in a way that was clear.
Yep.
To us today, I'm sure. So, yeah, I'm trying to think. There was one, just when we had talked before, you had mentioned some of the kind of, I guess like occultish type things that are in the temples themselves, or some of the, experiences you had with the sealing, or not the sealing, the baptisms for the dead, and those types of things. So if there's anything on that topic that you want to talk about, I will just throw it to you.
Yeah, and I think this also kind of speaks to what you were saying before when you were doing your ancestor work or in Mormon graveyards, where it's like they're these earthbound spirits that don't know what to do because they can't go anywhere. This is one of those like Mormon ceremonies that really, really doesn't help that kind of thing. So for those of you that don't know, and you've just kind of like heard Mormons baptize the dead, how they do this is like what 12 to 18-ish year olds will dress suits, and you go into this room where there's I went to the Portland Temple, so my experience is this is what the Portland Temple looks like. But you walk into this like 3-story kind of vault building that's all marble, and there's a platform on like the second and a half, like 3rd story of this building that leads out to this marble fountain that's full of like chlorine water. And the marble fountain is held on the backs of 12 life-size marble oxen, and 3 of them are each pointed into the cardinal direction. So there's 3 pointing north, 3 pointing east, southwest, and on their backs is this giant marble fountain, which has its significance from like, this is where you get into Masonic rites and the Temple of Solomon, and these are all kind of like recreations of things that they thought were happening there. But essentially they file in these 12 to 18-year-olds, and there's a person, there's a man standing in the fountain in the same white jumpsuit, and they have a teleprompter up, and it's this preset prayer where I, brother, blah, 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 in the name of Jesus Christ, do baptize you, blah, 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 in the name of, and then they have like a little slot for somebody who's dead. And then they say that name, who is dead. And then they baptize you. and then somebody moves the prompter name, so they say the same prayer over again, except they have a new dead person's name. And just as a 12-year-old, they just say this prayer like 12, 15 times, and you get dunked 12, 15 times. And then another 12-year-old comes out, and you are being baptized by proxy. So you are the proxy on earth with a physical form that is doing your celestial work for the dead person that is on the other side in what they call spirit prison. So when I do your work for the dead on this plane, I am allowing your spirit on that side to kind of become righteous enough to go to Mormon heaven, even though you weren't Mormon on earth. And this can get very problematic because a lot of this does not involve consent of any kind. Infamously, like the family of Anne Frank has had to petition the church like a dozen times to stop baptizing this poor Jewish girl who died in the Holocaust because we think she should be Mormon. You know what I mean? And they just don't listen, and they keep baptizing them anyway because, you know,
part of their ritual. Yeah.
And I think, yes, that may have a lot to do with the type of work you're doing, where you're dealing with like earthbound spirits who don't know what's keeping them there, or like why, or even if they do know that it's all nonsense, it's just like someone did something to me here and I'm stuck here and I don't know why. You're not the first person I've talked to who's talked about that. And then similar to that, I never did this, but in the upper levels of the temple, when you're older and you've done your other work, you then can go do like sealings and anointings for dead people as well. So then you can like seal dead families together, and do all of so like theoretically kids would do stuff on level 1, adults would do stuff on level 2. And then when everything's said and done, dead family from 1800s that you did all your genealogy work for, who wasn't Mormon, now is Mormon in in someone's eyes. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I've done some research on this, at least outwardly the church says, well, I mean, yes, but they would have to accept on the other side, right? The baptism.
Yeah.
If they don't accept, then they're not actually baptized, which is a lot of effort to go through.
There's also a lot of caveats to what yes means, and it's kind of a cop-out, but yes, they're supposed to get consent on the other side.
Yeah, and that bothered me a lot when I first heard about it. I kept thinking like, I also think like, how many times have I been baptized by proxy from other lives into this life?
Definitely really doesn't incorporate models like reincarnation. No,
they're not. Because you're all going to be in heaven together. You're not coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's really, really kind of strange. And I think, from a shamanic point of view, again, looking at it from the perspective of, okay, so now you have an earthbound spirit who is confused or is trapped or is, just kind of like in this space where they didn't know what to do. They didn't get crossed over when they should have. And then, somebody comes to them and says, I'm your family member. And the reason that you didn't get to where you wanted to be is because you didn't accept the Mormon church. If you do that now, you'll get there. And I can see like some percentage of people or these spirits are probably like, okay, sure, sounds plausible. And so I do think I guess I don't totally buy into the idea that the only reason the church is doing this is so that families can be together in heaven. It feels like, again, like this is a lot of effort and a cornerstone of the entire religion to somehow be collecting dead souls. Like there's something.
There's something weird there. And like I said, with the caveats, there's also times where they may not know it, but they don't want those people in heaven. The Mormon church is so anti-LGBTQ and so anti-trans. And like, I am sure that the baptismal work has been done for a number of people who in the history were closeted LGBTQ members. And under Mormon doctrine, if you are unapologetically gay and you're just like, no, this is who I am, and I'm okay with that, and that's fine, that's actually one of the few things that will get you sent to outer darkness. So like theoretically, This is a fun thought experiment a lot of seminary kids will like to do. Did Hitler go to heaven? Because he read the Book of Mormon, he heard the things, he actually more or less lived the word of wisdom. And if we do his work, is he going to be in heaven? And the answer is, from most of the people I've talked to going through seminaries, yes, he would be. If we did his work and he did the thing and he repented and he said, yes, yes. Same thought experiment. Would Harvey Milk, if we did Harvey Milk's work, would he go to heaven? If he refused to acknowledge that being gay was a sin, that's the only thing. No, he'd go to outer darkness. So yes, you can do the work for people, but I don't think always they think about whose work they're doing. Do you know what I mean? And I don't think you would actually invite a lot of these people into your heaven if you knew who they were. Consequently, another thing about Mormon heaven is anyone who is a person of color. Your colored skin is a result of God marking your ancestors out for having sinned. Therefore, on Judgment Day, when that curse is lifted, you are now white. Vis-a-vis, everybody in heaven is white. So maybe you're a person of color that is totally on board with the Mormon thing, but you're like, oh wait, I'm not going to be, but I'm beautiful. I don't want to change. That's now a problem. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's really interesting how many things are, it's again, this dichotomy between religion or like what the church says and like what God should be, right? Like the challenge between where it's like, if God truly loves and accepts everyone, and that is the basis of the religion.
Then why are all these rules here?
Right. None of the rest of this makes
everybody's
sense.
Cool.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, it's really complicated. And I think, hopefully as I kind of go through some of these other episodes in this season, want to touch on some of that, of like where we just keep going astray in this desire, to somehow, I don't know, control, restrict, categorize, make everyone be like us,
which is Mormonism to a T. Get on board or we'll murder you.
Right. Yeah, there's some weird, creepy stuff there. So, but it's found in many religions, and this is just like one way to explore one, because I think even though it has its own unusual flavors, if you go through a lot of religions, you find their own.
All of them, essentially. It's really hard to study any of them without finding horrible things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, even that, I go back to the, like thinking about the, 1800s, Christian religion, right? You think it's like this pious Victorian times, whatever. And then, you get into it, and you're like, not at all. That's not at all what was happening. So then you realize it doesn't take very many generations or very many years to kind of erase a piece of history that a certain organization just doesn't want to live on. And you get a couple generations and the kids don't remember, and that's that, it's gone.
And it's easy to kind of sell that. Terrence McKenna called it a nostalgia for paradise, where just like, it's really easy to sell that quaint idea that everybody had it figured out back then. It was so much simpler, and just, it was this quaint little thing that it's an easy way to whitewash history, and it's been used for a very, very long time. I've been asked before, like, what would you change about Mormonism? And like, after I go through my laundry list, I'm like, that's not Mormonism anymore. Like, so I don't know.
Yeah. At some point, there's things that we have to just let go of because they no longer serve us. And I guess everybody's making that choice.
The older I get and the more I get into this, the more I'm getting of the opinion that just burn it down and just start new.
All right. Well, have a great rest of your day. And we'll be in touch soon.
Okay. Thanks again for being patient this morning.
Yeah, no worries. It worked out.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye.